Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Tuesday, January the 4th, 2022. Sam Hyde, remember him? Comedian, funny man. Was given a network comedy show. It was canceled in horror after 6 episodes. Yeah, that was back in the golden age of 2016 or something like that. He's associated with a famous, even a notorious statement. Quote, when we win, do not forget that these people want you broke, dead, your kids raped and brainwashed, and they think it's funny, unquote. Ryan Landry commented on this 3 years ago. When Hyde stated this, it seemed a bit hyperbolic. It is not anymore. One step further, do they even think it's funny? Read their tweets. It is fury and rage that fuels these cretins to go after high school students for smirking. These people become mind readers of teenagers on short video clips. They project their whom and made for TV law and order casting to see non white as good and white as evil. Forget the cocks who fell for another scam again. They are meaningless. Do not even give them hate clicks. Focus on the fact that these people want you dead and are filled with a hate that no soldier holds. Have you read old war memoirs? Often you will read how soldiers respected and even admired opponents, even they knew that it was their duty to kill them. They were not filled with the rage we see from the Western left towards their opponents. With that in mind, we'll move to an essay published today in the American Mind by Michael Anton, which is called Blue America's Messaging Problem, Fighting the Impulse for National Divorce with Spousal Abuse. On December the 19th, 2021, less than a week before Christmas, the Biden White House issued a statement containing the following extraordinary sentence, which astonished even the administration's harshest critics and alarmed many inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt. Quote, for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm, unquote. Anton comments, it's rare to employ this kind of undiplomatic language even against America's global adversaries, against American citizens, hence so many shocked and angry responses. But few should have been surprised. Blue rhetoric toward red America, unquestionably the target of the above outburst, has been unrelentingly punitive since at least 2015, and increasingly so in recent months. As one illustration, when offered the opportunity to walk back the above statement, the White House doubled down and its media allies followed suit. Clearly, they're committed to this kind of talk. To what end, we shall see below. Time was a political message was crafted to appeal to people, either to the broadest possible majority, think FDR in 32, LBJ in 64, Nixon in 72, and Reagan in 84, or to a committed base that can eke out a narrow victory, G.W. Bush twice, Obama's re-election, and Trump in 2016. A good message may be positive, negative, or like Biden's in 2020, both. I'm not Trump, and let's get back to normal. A message does not have to be truthful to be effective. In fact, political consultants generally agree that a dual message, why I'm great and the other guy is awful, works best. But they also emphasize that the positive one, what I'm going to do for you, is more important than the negative, what the other guy will do to you. A negative message by itself typically leads to defeat. Broadly speaking, consultants recognize two kinds of messaging problems, no message and bad message. As to the former, there's Hillary Clinton in 2016. She was clearly animated by no issues, no burning concerns except her own lust for power. For a bad message, look no further than Terry McAuliffe's 2021 campaign for Virginia governor. Highlights include telling parents they should have no say over their children's education and asserting that one of the state's great crises is too many white teachers, i.e., mounting a direct assault on his party's key constituency. One type of message consultants never discuss is the negative message aimed at those whose votes you're ostensibly trying to win. Call it, here's how I plan to screw you. This would seem to be, in political terms, the quintessence of the bad message, not merely ineffective, but downright counterproductive. Yet this is Blue America's consistent message for red. One may reply that since no blue politician honestly seeks any red votes, the observation is inapt. But elite blues are seeking something from the reds, not votes, to be sure. They know that red votes are immaterial to blue success, but acquiescence, acceptance, quietude, compliance, obedience, fealty, even gratitude. And they're trying to catch red flies not with honey, but with oceans of vinegar. Michael Anton continues, there has been lately, and mostly but not entirely from the right, a great deal of talk about some form of separation, ranging from the late Angelo Codevilla's call for radical federalism to David Riaboy's bolder proposal for national divorce. The latter obviously would split the union, but the former is designed to keep it together by reducing domestic tensions that presently threaten to tear it apart. The responses from blues to both proposals were instantaneous, furious, and uniform. Hell no, and how dare you? Under no circumstances may Reds have any degree of independence, self determination, or control of their collective destinies. We know what would happen then, quote, the accelerated subjugation of women and people of color in a new adjacent red America, unquote. The rejection of climate orthodoxy and endless attacks from our religious zealot neighbors. Ed Kilgore, the author of this admirably frank screed, concludes even more bluntly, quote, I won't let you go. I have no illusions of compromises yet untried or third ways left unexplored. So let's have it right out here in America as peacefully as we can manage. Perhaps if we continue to battle for control of our common country, one side or the other might win a popular mandate to exercise real power and change the facts on the ground, breaking the perpetual stalemate. If not, then let's consider the wisdom of those who crushed the Confederacy in the belief that the misery of political conflict is better than the literal civic death of national disunion, unquote. Anton comments, won't let you go. Have it out right here. Battle for control. Exercise real power and change the facts on the ground. Misery of political conflict and the coup de grace crushed. You will stay in this marriage forever, whether you like it or not, and do what you're told. Rebecca Solnit likens red reluctance to accept the blue agenda to a dam that will inevitably be breached, with everything on the other side overwhelmed and washed away. She charitably admits that, therefore, red fears are warranted in the sense that their direst predictions are fated to come true, but also illegitimate because they deserve what's coming to them. Birth can be violent and dangerous, she concludes, and sometimes one or the other of the two involved die, leaving little doubt as to who will be sacrificed in the emergence of coast to coast Bluetopia. Don't say you weren't warned. By contrast, blue elites don't hesitate to promote their own followers candy and flowers, universal health care, to promise rather, universal health care, universal preschool, universal free college, universal basic income, free housing, student debt forgiveness, the Green New Deal, mask and vax mandates, decriminalization of everything except entering the Capitol without first getting a tour pass, etc. All the stuff romantic lefty dreams are made of. They've come through only on the latter two and don't seem to be close to making good on the others. But from the perspective of messaging, that's irrelevant. The point is blue voters and camp followers hear a positive message. What is the positive blue message for Reds? What do blue elites promise to middle America, even things they have no intention of delivering? How do they try to convince the heartland that the coastal agenda will benefit them? I hear only crickets, writes Anton, apart perhaps from the occasional rhetorical appeals to the so-called middle class, which are immediately undercut, indeed belied, by blue elite's constant attack on whites, who still make up the bulk of what's left of that class, by their fanatical adherence to an environmental agenda that kills red jobs and jacks up living expenses, and also to their woke left vanguard's shrill insistence that middle class as a category is inherently exploitative and oppressive. Bill Clinton, and to a lesser extent Barack Obama, together won 4 national elections, in part by convincing millions of flyover Americans that they had their best interests at heart. Clinton promised them cheaper health care, higher wages, less crime and welfare reform. Obama even cheaper health care, infrastructure, extrication from Iraq, and better race relations. Joe Biden sort of attempted something similar, but the incoherence of his 2020 campaign rhetoric illustrates the present problem. On the one hand, Biden or his handlers tried to campaign as the sensible alternative, not just to the allegedly unstable Trump, but to the fringes of the Democratic Party. It's me or Orange Man to my right, or else the socialist Bernie or the vituperative Pocahontas way off to my left. But the other part of Biden's message was crafted to appease the woke left at every turn. Structural racism, mostly peaceful protests. Jussie told the truth. Medicare for illegal immigrants, full speed ahead with transgenderism, etc. To which, as president, he has added such unifying gems as 21st century Jim Crow, greatest threat to our democracy since the Civil War, and the like. The Democratic Party and its intellectuals, Anton continues, try to make a distinction between anti-whiteness and anti-white, the former being legitimate, necessary opposition to entrenched privilege and racism, the latter being the kind of hatred of actual people that nobody, of course, could ever countenance. Except it's hard, conceptually or rhetorically, to separate the two. The very suffix "ness" presupposes some category of quality to which it's applied. If there can't be whiteness without whites, how logically can one be against the former but for, or at least not hostile toward the latter? They don't have a coherent answer to that question. Part of the practical point seems to be to distinguish what John Derbyshire calls good whites from bad whites. Only the latter are infected with whiteness, or at least refuse to repudiate it. The former, though still white, feel sufficiently guilty about that and are eager to be good allies by making amends. But none of this matters for present purposes. The point under consideration is, what do bad whites hear? What's the message of critical race theory, which, as we know, A, doesn't exist, B, is only the routine teaching of accurate history, and C, is absolutely crucial to fairness and justice in contemporary education? Here's what they hear: you and your children are evil because of your race, because of what your ancestor did or are alleged to have done, and for what you have done and continue to do. Even if you think you're innocent, at the very least, you benefit from a system designed to help you unfairly at the expense of others. And let's face it, you're not innocent. You may not be able to name your specific sins. The guilty always insist they're innocent. But just ask us and we'll tell you. There's no way for you or your progeny to escape this guilt or discharge your debt. You earned none of what you have. Everything you believe you or your ancestors built, you didn't. Either that or your accomplishments are merely cogs in an oppressive system and must be entirely remade. Your heroes were, in fact, villains. Their statues must come down and everything memorializing them renamed. There is nothing in your past of which to be proud, only ashamed. Your proper place in the new order is one of permanent penance and subservience, and your refusal to confess is further evidence of your guilt. Rarely is the argument stated so directly or concisely, but the logic of every woke discourse, from Twitter flame wars at the low end to the mega bestsellers of Coates and D'Angelo at the high, all lead inevitably in this direction. To see that, all one need do is dare them to deny it. Try getting a wokester to say white people aren't uniquely and inherently evil, or the United States is no longer structurally racist, and report back on how it goes. Against any other demographic group, Anton writes, such rhetoric and tactics would be condemned as proto-genocidal. But anti-white venom not only gets a pass, the person who points it out is condemned and even canceled, cancellation being, like critical race theory, another thing the official narrative insists doesn't exist. What both tactics have in common is effectiveness at rallying the woke masses to preserve elite power. But they also risk rousing the retrograde domestic enemy who might be provoked to organize in opposition. That cannot be allowed. And so the perceived threat must be denied and dismissed with vehemence, even as it continues to be made in order to rally ruling class shock troops. This is the core reason for the ubiquitous spectacle of simultaneous affirmation denials. The ruling class needs to say both for entirely different, but equally necessary reasons. Blue America's message problems don't stop there. The remainder boil down to the ruling class's stance on democracy, both with respect to specific issues and to the overarching concept itself. As to the former, blues insist that any policy wants that blues don't is ipso facto illegitimate, or worse. Border wall, workplace enforcement, skills-based immigration. All are not merely unacceptable, but racist and evil. Tariffs are some sort of protection for American workers and industries. Unacceptable, unworkable, economically illiterate, and also racist, if only because everything Reds wants is. Ditto the Red desire to stop fighting endless, pointless, windless wars and to reduce America's overseas commitments. Strategic folly, a betrayal of allies and of our core values, collusion with other enemies, even treason. And of course, it's racist to doubt the efficacy or strategic value of democracy wars in the third world. On New Year's Day, the New York Times, arguably the most powerful institution of any kind in America, thundered that all opposition to the blue agenda is violent insurrection. Hilariously, the Times intoned that a, quote, healthy functioning political party faces its electoral losses by assessing what went wrong and redoubling its efforts to appeal to more voters the next time, unquote. Really? Was that the Democratic response to 2016? Or that of Stacey Abrams and all her supporters, none of whom, including the Vice President of the United States, has ever conceded that she lost in 2018? But the rest of the editorial makes clear that no Democratic loss nor Republican win is ever legitimate. When we win, that's democracy. When you win, that's authoritarianism. This is the view not just of the New York Times, but of the constellation of elite American institutions and blue true believers, very much including the entire Democratic Party for whom the Times speaks. Democratic super lawyer Mark Elias, father of the Russia hoax and instrumental player in changing the rules of the 2020 election midstream, has predicted that, should Republicans win back either House of Congress in 2022, a litigation effort will be mounted to prevent members from taking their seats. The pretext would be Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, included to prevent literal Confederates from serving after the Civil War. Insurrectionists, you see, are ineligible. Who gets to determine who counts as an insurrectionist? Here's one clue: not the people who vote for them. It's tempting to call democracy meaningless in today's parlance, Anton argues, except that it has a meaning, the opposite of what its dictionary entry says. Democracy now means not the rule or sovereignty of the people, but the fiat of elites and experts. When the people can be persuaded, duped, or bullied into ratifying expert insistence, so much the better. That extra pretense of legitimacy helps quiet and discredit dissent. When they can't, no matter. The right thing will be done come what may, and that too is democratic under the new meaning. The cloyingly disingenuous phrase, our democracy, really means their oligarchy. Reds are not included, except as subjects. Like converts who, in their zeal, become more Catholic than the Pope, admittedly not hard to do with this Pope, none are more aggressive or uncompromising in promoting the blue message than so-called ex-conservatives. Case in point, in a widely noted September op-ed, longtime neoconservative fixture and now blue enforcer Robert Kagan declared that the only legitimate posture for Republicans going forward is complete acquiescence to the elite leftist Democratic agenda. From government spending to defense to immigration to the persistent COVID-19 pandemic to election reform to the filibuster, the message is the same: give us everything we want or you will be fomenting mass violence, a breakdown of federal authority, and the division of the country into warring red and blue enclaves. We may indeed be drifting towards such terrible things, but it's reasonable to ask who's more responsible for that drift. Those demonizing half the country and telling them that it's our way or the highway, and if you object, you're a Confedero-Nazi. Perhaps unaware of Godwin's law, Kagan actually includes a Hitler comparison. Or those who, unsurprisingly, object to constantly being called Confedero-Nazis and told that their role in our civic life is to get nothing and like it. In another widely noted essay by prominent ex-con David Brooks, sermonized that, quote, to be conservative on racial matters is a moral crime, unquote. He did not specify what exactly constitutes conservatism on racial matters. Jim Crow? Nearly all conservatives and Trump supporters would agree that state-imposed racial segregation is a moral crime. I add the qualifier nearly only because, as with anything, there must be an outlier somewhere. But if he's out there, he has precisely zero voice in national affairs. To the contrary, the existence of an open, vocal racist would be a godsend to blue elites who insist racism is everywhere but consistently have trouble finding any. This is one reason why, for instance, disgraced buffoon Richard Spencer, with his faux Adolf haircut, is still allowed 70,000 Twitter followers. The narrative requires fascists and better an nth gen mimeograph of a Klansman than their complete absence. To most on the right today, to be conservative on racial matters means treating people equally, impartial enforcement of the laws, and no negative discrimination or favoritism either for individuals or groups. This is, in fact, the heart of the American creed that Brooks and so many other so called conservatives once claimed to revere. But now he calls it a moral crime. Let the impact of those two words sink in. You are not merely misguided, but immoral, and your transgression is not merely an error, nor even a mistake made in bad faith, but a crime. You are an immoral criminal for disagreeing with me, say the very people who lecture us on civility and accuse us of divisiveness. And Michael Anton concludes, expropriation has never been, to my knowledge, a winning political message with its targets. At any rate, there are two ways to do it: steal from the living or from the dead. Supposing we take Ibram X. Kendi's word that he and his allies have no intention of killing anyone, that means they'll need to steal from the living. That may work for a bit if large sections of the country can be bullied into believing they deserve it, but for how long? When people know they are working for others and who hate them to boot, how productive can they reasonably be expected to be? We must rule you punitively forever, and if you so much as complain, you are literally Hitler. All shall love me and despair. That is Blue America's message to Red. Whether or not it can cede and for how long are the core political questions of our time. Yes, Kendi, Anton reports, recently bellowed that white uneasiness over woke rhetoric is only further proof of white racism. It's ridiculous for whites to think they have anything to fear. No one wants to kill them, even though they deserve it. And no, they do. Here's a quote from Kendi. White supremacists probably fear revenge, retaliation, the tables turning, as they wipe the blood of democracy, of equality, of the dying and dead off their hands. Like the enslavers of old sleeping with guns under their pillows, they know the level of brutality they have levied against people of color and their white allies. Indigenous anti-racists just want their land back and aren't genocidal. Black anti-racists just want reparations and don't want to enslave. Asian anti-racists just want to be visible and don't want to render white people invisible. Latino and Middle Eastern anti-racists just want to flee violence and don't want to invade predominantly white nations. Land, money, visibility, whatever that is, and perpetual free passage into the United States. The word for this is expropriation. And again, this is an essay at the AmericanMind.org by Michael Anton called Blue America's Messaging Problem. Now, those of us who have been following the left closely know that this is not really new. I mentioned an essay written, I think around 2015 or 2016 by law professor called Mark Tushnet, where he argued bluntly that the culture war is over. We have won, and now it's time to shoot the wounded. Because people who were wicked enough to be on the wrong side of the culture war deserve nothing. I'm looking at Michael Anton's Wikipedia entry here, and there is something quite telling. It says that Nils Gilman, an employee at the Berggruen Institute and co-founder of the Transition Integrity Project, yes, just the tip, compared Anton in a 2020 tweet to Robert Brasillach and said he deserves the same fate, that's a quote, as Brasillach, who was executed by a firing squad in 1945. I note further that this Wikipedia entry says that Anton is a classically trained chef. He's also an aesthete with a penchant for classical men's tailoring and fashion. Perhaps that explains the reference to Robert Brasillach, who was a homosexual. Let's go to the chat. Oh, hello to No Sleep Till Breezewood PA, to Anrun, Dan, Pelcasso 88, our Finnish friend Jaakko Raipala, to Don Willis. No Sleep says World Peace was the best Adult Swim since Xavier Renegade Angel. Hello to Chogokin666 and William Hicks. They violated my sinus at Chogokin666. Is it reference to a test? Is it? COVID test? Hello to V. Hugh. Don Willis says Sam Hyde is a genius. Dr. Deadname, yes, refers to Biden, the great uniter and happy warrior. Thank you for your kind words, Chogokin66. Hello to Jeff Godley, a new name to me. William Hicks, so I hear Trudeau has a pretty low opinion of the unvax. We are the lowest of the low, racist, misogynistic, etc. Terrible, terrible people. Wicked to the core, LOL, beyond redemption. I can have something to say about that in a few minutes. Anna says, I think Kevin said in a recent stream that they will have to stop with the COVID nonsense soon. Reality will force them to. Anyone think that this is so? Well, I mean, Biden's thrown in the towel. You remember he was going to take care, he was going to eliminate COVID. Now he says it's not the federal government's job. It's up to the states. So he spent the whole of last year and much of this year blaming Donald Trump personally for every person who died or is alleged to have died of COVID-19. But now that his death count has passed Trump's death count, nothing to do with him. Yakarapala says Macron outdid him. He said that the unvaxxed are no longer citizens of France. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Well, again, I'm thinking of Pareto distribution. 20% of the 20%. That's all it takes. Chogokin666 says, I'm sadly surprised about how many New Yorkers are being fooled for the nth time. Everyone masked up, mobile testing sessions in the street with actual people lining up. These tests are useless, first of all. They're inciting panic. We got to go to the hospital because I have a sore throat. Has everyone forgotten what it's like to have the flu or a severe cold? I mean, a couple of times in my life, I had the flu and I was knocked on my ass for over a week, sweating like a horse, shaking, almost, suffering hallucinations, being totally exhausted. But no, apparently anytime someone suffers from a respiratory ailment, that must be COVID now. Policies in Helsinki, 90% mask rate during the day. I went out on New Year's Eve and it was like 99% unmasked. It's starting to look like prohibition with the disconnect between day behavior and night behavior. No Sleep says, I hope Eric Zemmour talks about what it means to be a citizen in France if Macron wants to force that issue. Well, yes. Eliminationist language. I mean, Macron and Trudeau are not considered to be particularly left-wing, but they're engaging in language, along with Joe Biden, which could be said to be eliminationist. Who else do we have here? Hello to David Wright and Metal Mike. In Quebec, they're seriously considering preventing unvaccinated people from entering liquor stores and cannabis shops. Oh, that could lead to trouble. In my own city of Victoria, number of people wearing masks on the street. And keep in mind that this is an island and it's a windy place. I would say 70 to 80% of people outside, at least in the downtown area, are wearing masks outdoors, whether they're, in a group of two or alone. Let's see. Hello to John S., who says that Jim Crow was a humanitarian attempt at reconciliation. And who else do we have here? Visionary Companion says hello from Seattle, still in the district. How did the apartment hunting go? Well, it's going to take a while, I think, because I have some unique challenges there. What's this? Met who? Yako Rapala met her in real life once. I started ignoring her completely when she went nuts for Corona. Who would that be? Who would that be? Oh, Tina Wick. Oh, I see. Okay. Can we just have a negative to positive test ratio instead of just the number of positive tests? Well, you know, we had this call for tests. So all these tests are being handed out. Yeah, get your test, get your test. Now, these tests are not exactly being administered under laboratory conditions. And even if they were, the number of false positives is off the scale. Don Henlo Borther says, I have been walking into stores without a mask, nonchalant. No one even cares. Yes. Well, treat them the way that they would treat you. I think that's one takeaway from Michael Anton's essay. And this is encouraging in that regard. This is from Nicholas Balassi at justthenews.com, addressing the possibility of a GOP-controlled House impeaching President Biden in 2022. House GOP conference chairwoman Elise Stefanik told Just the News that, quote, anything is on the table when we are in the majority, unquote. Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz said recently there's a chance a Republican-led House would move to impeach Biden, specifically for his handling of the southern border crisis. Stefanik shared her reaction to the comments Cruz made about impeachment. Anything is on the table when we are in the majority, but I believe what we should focus on is conducting oversight and making sure that we're passing legislation to secure the border once and for all. The policies of the previous administration under President Trump were working. Well, none of this is going to work until the people who have come in illegally are deported, or at least they're deported in such large numbers, and the lives of the people who have yet to be deported are made so miserable that they leave voluntarily. Because why not just take a chance? Oh, yeah, this is illegal, it's illegal, but they get to stay. And they get the Gibbs on top of that. And a little more evidence of, life in contemporary America. This is from the Daily Caller. Chrissy Clark. 2 students at Arizona State University were found guilty of interfering with university activities after video footage showed them harassing 2 white male students for studying in the university's multicultural center, according to an Instagram post of the duo complaining about their punishment. Undergraduate student Mastani Qureshi and graduate student Sarah Takola posted a video on Instagram alleging that ASU investigated their actions and called on them to write a 3-page paper on how next time when they talk with white people about race and society, they will be civil. I very much doubt that was the language of what they were told to do. The students were charged with interfering with or disrupting university or university-sponsored activities, according to emails obtained by Campus Reform. On September 23rd, Qureshi and Takola claimed that hateful and racist symbology invaded our multicultural center when 2 students, one of whom wore an anti-Biden shirt and another who had a Chick-fil-A cup and a Police Lives Matter computer sticker, sat near Black students. The duo appeared to harass and dox the students by screaming at them and dubbing their study location peak white cis male bullshit. Well, I mean, there's an easy way around this, isn't there? I mean, bring real segregation to the universities. That Black students would and Arabic students would no longer have to be outraged by being around white people because they would not be allowed near white people. Similarly, the reverse would happen. You see, they want Bantustans. In a way, they want Bantustans. They want to be able to go everywhere they want to go, but white people must be increasingly restricted in where they choose to go. Oh, dear white people, aka ASU, you openly discriminated against us on November 16th when you hounded down your decision from your racially biased investigation, Qureshi said. We're being persecuted for defending our multicultural center from racism and sexism. ASU is a violent place. Takola argued that asking students of color to be more civil in the face of alleged white supremacy and neo-Nazism, it's a quote, by the way, is actually violent. The duo claims they have received rape, death, and lynching threats on social media and suffered from emotional and psychological violence. Qureshi and Takola ended their video by claiming that ASU is number 1 in ignoring marginalized students. And I'm looking at a picture of the duo. And of course, one of them has, well, numerous piercings around the eyebrows. And of course, the now almost de rigueur septum piercing. And huh, Amy, yes, Amy Reed, the dumbest woman on TV. Joy Amy Reed, or I always get them mixed. Sometimes she uses two names, sometimes three. To start off the new year as they mean to go along, MSNBC's Joy Reid imparted a big fat dose of race baiting, declaring that white Christian conservatives believe America is their country and no one's else's. In a ranting monologue, Reid stated that there are white so-called Christian conservatives who feel like this country was built by them, for them. Where's the lie there? And so everyone but them needs to suck it up and let them have their way or else. Their party, the Republicans, have gone from pretending to be the party of personal responsibility to unmasking themselves as the party of selfish people that cannot play well with others. Yeah, they call that projection. And they even have their own cable networks. Oh, golly. Plus something called Getter, which kind of sounds like porn. Moving on, Reid bizarrely stated. Referring to conservatives as special citizens, recharged as they walk around saying things like, I don't want to wear a mask, and if you try to attack me, I'll attack the low-wage clerks at the store, at the Burger King. I don't want to get the vaccine either. If people get sick from me, oh, well, not my problem. I don't know whether this is a very stupid woman, but she must know that the highest level of vaccine hesitancy, as it's called in America, is among Black people. And she might remember when Mayor Beetlejuice of Chicago was shouted down by Black people when she was railing on at them about masks and social distancing and the like. Yes, this following story in no way smacks of an effort by the Chinese Communist Party. This is from Jason Herring at the Calgary Herald. Members of Calgary's Chinese community are demanding a public apology from Premier Jason Kenney for what they describe as racist comments made in a recent media interview. More than 60 people gathered outside of McDougall Centre on a frigid New Year's Day morning to condemn Kenney's comments, in which he told Calgary Sun columnist Rick Bell in a year-end interview, "What's the next bat soup thing out of Wuhan? I don't know." Attendees held signs with lines like "Racism is a disgrace to Alberta" and "Zero tolerance in anti-Asia hate," as a series of speakers took to the mic with concerns the Premier's comments will worsen discrimination against Chinese Canadians, a group which faced an increase in vitriol following the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. "We gather here to voice concern on Jason Kenney's irresponsible and toxic comments," said John Mong Wu during the rally. "This type of language has provoked a significant increase in hate crimes against Asian people in general and Chinese in particular." SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, was first identified in Wuhan, China in late 2019. A viral video, which circulated shortly afterwards, purported bat soup in a Wuhan wet market was the origin of the virus, but that claim was quickly debunked. Oh, it was. Was it? Are any claims about the origin of COVID-19 been debunked? I don't think so. I mean, what would be worse in terms of inciting ill feeling against the Chinese? That this was accidental, that it came about from eating weird things, or that it just happened to leak out of the virology lab that is, 500 yards away from that wet market? Kenny made an apology. If anyone was upset, then I'm sad, etc. I'm sorry if people felt offended by what I said. That was not my intention. I certainly want to thank the Chinese Canadian community in Alberta for the tremendous care that is shown in being responsible during COVID. Whatever that works. Whatever that means. Wu works at the Foothills Medical Center as a medical technologist. He said he's faced racism as a frontline worker since the start of the pandemic, including from one patient who demanded that he speak English when he was already speaking the language, and from another who refused his care altogether. Yeah, again, This is in no way anything to do with the Chinese Communist Party, which is in no way set up a fifth column in Canada. That would be an outrageous accusation to make, or even to think it. And on the topic of treason, I just sort of, it's not even special anymore. This is from Jane Clinton at The Guardian. Ministers are keen to ease immigration restrictions in a bid to make it easier for thousands of Indian citizens to live and work in the UK as part of forthcoming trade talks. The potential offer will be under discussion with the International Trade Secretary, and Marie Trevelyan travels to Delhi this month. So essentially, as I understand this story, India is saying, we will open up our markets to British companies only if we get to send even more people to India. To Britain rather. And costs for visas and all that are slashed. And people get to spend years and then they have to go home. But of course, they will not go home. These people would literally sell their grandmothers for a few bucks. Again, from Just the News, and this story just gets funnier and funnier. This is from Greg Piper. The tiffs between New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her critics became ribald Friday after she was spotted vacationing in Florida, a state whose COVID-19 policies she has long denounced as too lenient. National Review published a tipster's photos Thursday night of AOC dining in Miami Beach, as New York City, parts of which he represents in Congress, reported a record number of new confirmed cases of COVID-19. She had faulted GOP Senator Ted Cruz in February for similarly fleeing Texas for Cancun during the state's winter storm crisis, and brought up the incident 2 months later. The leftist squad congresswoman, whose mother lives in Florida, apparently didn't respond to criticism of the perceived hypocrisy until the election campaign for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis asked if she was enjoying a taste of freedom here. Hasn't Governor DeSantis been inexplicably missing for like 2 weeks? She tweeted. Yeah. Hang on a sec. It turns out that DeSantis' wife is seriously ill with breast cancer. Perhaps AOC could have made some sort of effort to, why DeSantis wasn't so much in the public eye as he had been previously. After Cortez mocked her partner's gross pale male feet visible in the photo, AOC responded, if Republicans are mad they can't date me because they can just say that instead of projecting their sexual frustrations onto my boyfriend's feet, ya creepy weirdos. If this ginger has such gross pale male feet, why is she having sexual relations with him? And you just know that she didn't want to use the phrase date me. Date me. That sounds like something a prostitute would say. So this horse-faced woman is of the opinion that she is so very sexually irresistible. She continued, it's starting to get old, ignoring the very obvious, strange, and deranged sexual frustrations that underpin the Republican fixation on me, women, and alphabet people in general. Oh, I see. She's arguing like a homosexual here. So apparently people have problem with, trannies because they're all, madly, sexually attracted to them. Of course, that's absolute nonsense. When Daily Wire editor Ian Howarth rejected the Congresswoman's speculation as to himself, she mocked him for oversharing. I hear if you say it enough times, you'll actually start to believe it. Amid the barrage of online mockery of AOC for her sexual frustrations theory, town hall columnist Kurt Schlichter said, this is masterful if it works, and it might. AOC switched the topic from her abandonment of her constituents to a hellscape of COVID doom in favor of the mass-free liberty of Florida, and steered the discussion to how hot she is, all props. So we saw her drinking some, designer cocktail and eating sushi, and then she went to a huge drag event. I guess there's not going to be very many people at that drag event who are going to be all hot and bothered about AOC. I note that she is now 32 years old. She has never been married and she has no children. Well, tick, a tick, a tick. And it's a weird situation. I mentioned this several times before, but it is a very weird situation that when my province of British Columbia, which is far more left-wing than Ontario and has a NDP, sort of neo-socialist government, as opposed to the so-called progressive conservative government in Ontario, that province has gone noticeably crazier than my province. My province has gone pretty crazy, but not as crazy as Doug Ford's Ontario. This is from Carissa Wilson at CP24. Ontario is reporting more than 11,000 new COVID-19 cases as hospitalizations continue to rise due to the rapidly spreading Omicron variant, which prompted the government to implement a slew of tougher restrictions yesterday. Health Minister Christine Elliott tweeted on Tuesday that there are at least 1,290 people with the virus in Ontario hospitals, compared to 1,232 a day ago and 491 a week ago. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean that they're in the hospitals? That they go to the hospital, they go to the emergency ward because they have the sniffles, because they have a cough, because they have a sore throat, because they have a fever or a headache? Of those in hospital, 266 are in intensive care, up from 248 yesterday, and 128 are breathing with the help of a ventilator. Well, again, let's just check how many people live in the province of Ontario. It is 14.9 million people. Oh, so 266 of them in ICU. Well, that's obviously a near catastrophe. Yes, as a result, William Osler Health System declared Code Orange yesterday, a temporary measure to ensure internal and external resources are deployed efficiently to address capacity pressures and staffing challenges. The province reported today that 10 more people died with the virus in the past month, raising the death toll to 10,239. That is not very many people. Either, 10 in the past month plus the overall total, considering how many people live in the province of Ontario. But let's check out the vax status. Among the latest cases, 219 have an unknown vax status, 445 are partially vaccinated, 1,647 are unvaccinated, and 9,040 of the individuals are fully vaccinated. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get jabbed once, twice, three times the charm, and probably fourth. Now, I'm just going to keep harping on this because it's really remarkable. The American press, several right-wing outlets in the American media have picked up on this. I did searches on both Google and DuckDuckGo late last night. Not a single mainstream or any Canadian media outlet has mentioned what the Prime Minister of Canada said on Quebec TV last week. We all know we're going to end this pandemic by proceeding with the vaccination. We all know people who are deciding whether or not they're willing to get vaccinated, and we will do our very best to try to convince them. However, there's still a part of the population that is fiercely against it. They don't believe in science and progress and are very often misogynistic and racist. It's a very small group of people, but that doesn't shy away from the fact that they take up some space. This leads us as a leader and as a country to make a choice. Do we tolerate these people? Oh, and yes, of course, the media is not going to comment on that, the Prime Minister of Canada using eliminationist language against 20% of the population. And one can always depend on Tasha Karedin in the National Post to express panic over just about anything. Why didn't Ontario move sooner? What's wrong with you, Doug Ford? And there is some sanity on this issue from the Toronto Sun. Anthony Fury has done quite a good job. Ontarians are locked down again, and that's unacceptable. It's common practice in wartime for generals and other senior figures to be subbed out if things aren't going well. Yet here in Ontario, where the province has been plunged once again into lockdown because of healthcare capacity issues, all of the top healthcare execs are still sitting comfortably in their cushy jobs. Make no mistake about it, public health officials aren't particularly concerned about vaccinated people in their 20s, 30s, or 40s getting the Omicron variant. It's been confirmed by Public Health Ontario that the variant is significantly milder than the Delta variant. Ontario schools are not shutting down out of concern for the kids themselves. Far from it. Prior to Omicron, there were only 40 elementary school-aged kids hospitalized due to COVID-19 in Ontario throughout the course of the pandemic. Keep in mind, that is less than 24 months, not quite 2 a month. As pediatric infectious diseases physicians have maintained, this virus has thankfully proven to be less severe than influenza in kids. No, schools and everything else are shutting down because of concerns that even though the variant is milder for the individual, the sheer volume of new infections could mean that the tiny percentage of people who do have a rough time of it is enough to overwhelm the hospitals. Fair enough. But Ontarians must then push back and ask, what the hell does that have to do with me? And especially, what the hell does that have to do with my kids? Ontarians did what was asked of them. They got vaccinated, many of them 3 times. Their kids got vaccinated. They followed all the rules. They lost out on so many big life moments. They went without seeing loved ones for months on end. They downloaded the Vaccine Passport QR app, which we were told would be guaranteed no more lockdowns. And what happens after they do all of that in the face of a milder variant? Everything gets shut down, and they're told they must do more. It's time to say enough is enough. Matt Anderson, who took the podium at Monday's announcement, is president and CEO of Ontario Health. He is paid over $630,000 per year to effectively manage the healthcare system. Anthony Dale is president and CEO of the Ontario Hospitals Association, who is paid $433,000 per year to likewise effectively balance the issues facing hospitals. They are just 2 examples of the hundreds of very well-paid healthcare bureaucrats who, unlike our frontline heroes, haven't delivered the excellence that we have a right to expect from them. Canadian taxpayers have collectively thrown hundreds of billions of dollars at COVID-19. Today, there are 244 people in ICU in Ontario for COVID-19. It's simply not acceptable that children should be denied schooling and society shut down because a G7 nations hospital system is somehow threatened by such a volume. Well, see, nobody wants to talk about rationing because, of course, there's no rationing of healthcare in Canada, but of course there is rationing of healthcare in Canada, and that's a dirty little secret. So it's not going to be mentioned. And let's see. Yes, this is some sanity showing up in Ontario. This is again from Anthony Fury. And Dr. Kieran Moore, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Latrine Walla for Ontario, he said we have to pivot. And what a pivot it turned out to be. The province has made radical changes to some of the ways COVID-19 is being managed. One of the biggest measures is that isolation rules have been changed to be in line with those recently announced by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And testing is also about to undergo huge changes. No more lineups for tests because effective Friday, publicly funded PCR testing will only be given to high-risk persons who are symptomatic. The government is asking members of the general public who have mild symptoms to not seek testing. One reporter asked if this meant that the COVID-19 daily case counts would effectively become meaningless, and the chief medical officer agreed, saying we need to look beyond those numbers anyway. In other words, during the age of Omicron, Ontario is moving towards a system where the public is entrusted to figure out for themselves if they are sick or not, and then make respectful and responsible choices to ensure they don't get sick. And this is also big, very big, and should have got a lot more attention. Another big move was the acknowledgement that Ontario's daily reported COVID hospitalization numbers haven't been telling the full story. Dr. Moore confirmed that about 50% of them are currently for people who aren't actually suffering from COVID, but have gone to hospital with something else, like a broken leg, and just happened to test positive for the virus. Yes, and as we know, based on data from other countries, a great many of these people were almost certainly infected after going to the hospital. Oh, a very, very long article in Maclean's magazine by Stephen Marr. Misinformation from the US is the next virus, and it's spreading fast. It's deadly, malicious, and there's no vaccine. The infodemic is here, but it's not unstoppable. Well, how? You're going to throw people in prison, in concentration camps for spreading misinformation? This medicalization, this is very Soviet here. Oh, these terrible people are spreading virus, a deadly, malicious virus with no vaccine. It's an infodemic. He begins with the story of an alleged hoax in Halifax of a 13-year-old girl supposedly suffering myocarditis after getting the jab. And maybe this happened, maybe it didn't. But this is government propaganda, what we're getting here from Stephen Marr, because contraindications? No. He writes, serious vaccine-related illnesses are rare and carefully reported by doctors, are they? Well, perhaps you could give us some numbers, Marr. Perhaps you could even give us a link to the place where these vaccine-related illnesses are carefully reported by doctors. No, there isn't. Shepard, whose personal website described her as a tarot card reader, psychic, and jewelry designer, no longer has a social media presence. But Friesen, a misinformation super spreader, there we go. The medicalization of dissent didn't stop. Yes, and he has COVID-19, according to Marr. Again, this doesn't tell me very much about this fellow. What was the state of his health before he got COVID-19? What was the state? Is he obese? Morbidly obese? Does he suffer from cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc.? Other things? I mean, there should have been a concentration on this right from the very beginning, but no, everything got lumped together. And oh my God, it's the greatest, pandemic since the Spanish flu. Since the Spanish flu. And let's see, I'll look at a picture of what this Mark Friesen looks like. Of course, this is going to be a quite a popular name in the prairies. Let's see if I can get a picture of him. He's a big man, no question about that. But again, I don't know his medical history. And this story just goes on interminably. Ooh, toxic messages mutating like the virus. Doctors who should be focused on the 30 mutations in Omicron. Wow, there are almost as many mutations in Omicron as there are genders. The newest, most worrying variant. How is it the most worrying variant? Some expert called Strang says most of the misinformation he encounters has its roots in the U.S. Boo! With much of it going back to Donald Trump, who regularly spread misinformation. A report from the Communications Security Establishment, Canada's cybersecurity agency, thoroughly trustworthy, explains why, quote, Canada's media ecosystem is closely intertwined with that of the U.S. and other allies, which means that when their citizens are targeted, Canadians become exposed to online influence as a type of collateral damage. Targeted by whom? Oh, fever swamps of the American right. Oh, and then we have the fallacy of the excluded middle. Some say Bill Gates is implanting microchips in vaccine recipients. Others say COVID is caused by 5G towers. Friesen has tweeted about a globalist plot. Well, there is a globalist plot, and they don't bother to try and hide it. And as mentioned, the Rothschilds, a family that is often featured in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. One video Friesen shared asserts that shadowy figures at the World Economic Forum want to reduce the world's population to 500 million by forcing people to take vaccines that make them infertile. Well, World Economic Forum has made it clear that you will own nothing, you will have no privacy, and you will like it. That sounds pretty sinister to me. Oh, yes, let's dig up Richard Hofstadter and the paranoid style in American politics. Oh, a malignant thread. Again, people who disagree with him, with Stephen Maher, are diseased. This is the argument that he's making. And he makes a bunch of claims about Saskatchewan, which I'm not going to get into. Let's see, how many people does Saskatchewan have? It has approximately 1.2 million people. And how devastated has Saskatchewan been by COVID-19? Keep in mind, this is 2 years old by now. 960 deaths. 960 deaths. Yeah, that's not very serious at all. Not very serious at all. However, there's a strange anomaly when you look at their official COVID stats that supposedly the new cases, the new diagnoses, are overwhelmingly unvaccinated, which is the exact opposite of what we see in Ontario. And I frankly don't trust their figures. And well, just to put these numbers in perspective, about in a typical year, well, before COVID, something like 9,500, 9,700 people would die in Saskatchewan. This is just a blip, even assuming that all of those people could be said to have died from COVID and not with COVID. What else is going on in Saskatchewan? This is from Dan Zakreski at the CBC. 2020, a brutal year for fatal drug overdoses in Saskatchewan. Preliminary findings by coroner service show fatalities more than doubled from 2019. 379 people died with drug overdoses in the province last year. Could that be more people than died, supposedly, of COVID-19? We see a similar thing in British Columbia as well. And let's look at, okay. Let's see if Bruce Arthur is still as panicked as he has been. He must be pleased that, no, see, you demand that Doug Ford lock down the province again, and then you say it didn't happen soon enough. There are no more critical care beds available in Chatham, Kent. 15 of the 22 critical care beds are people with COVID-19. Oh, yeah, again, these numbers are useless without more explanation. Most patients with severe COVID are not vaccinated yet. We're having end-of-life discussions with families of patients in all categories. In all categories, says Tara Jeffrey. In all of the Sarnia Journal. In all categories. That is a gross exaggeration, to put it mildly. But never mind that. Children are dropping like flies, apparently. Oh, you know what else is going on in Canada? This, again, should be a very big story. And the Conservative Party, the official opposition, should be howling for people's heads. For the leading figures in Canadian forces to be sacked, for the Minister of Defense to be sacked. But no. So Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News, mass formation psychosis admittedly used by governments as tool of population control. Dr. Robert Malone's assertions about mass formation psychosis in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic are underscored by the fact that authorities in the UK admitted to using, quote, totalitarian methods of mind control, unquote, to instill fear in the population. During his viral podcast with Joe Rogan after he was banned from Twitter, Malone explained how the global population was being manipulated into remaining in a constant state of hysterical anxiety via mass formation psychosis. And of course, removed from Twitter. And I reviewed this book some months ago, Laura Dodsworth's book, A State of Fear, how the UK government weaponized fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I highly recommend it. But what's this about Canada? Someone called Frank, last of the Franks, tweeted mass psychosis is a myth, the same way the military running clandestine propaganda campaigns against its citizens is public health. This has actually happened. We find out that the government was illegally tracking tens of millions of people, but it gets even worse. This is a story from the Ottawa Citizen, and frankly, I have to admit that I'm rather surprised that it was allowed to appear there. It's from September of this year. And again, nothing was made in Parliament about this. Canadian military leaders saw the pandemic as a unique opportunity to test out propaganda techniques on an unsuspecting public, a newly released Canadian Forces report concludes. The federal government never asked for the so-called Information Operations Campaign, nor did Cabinet authorize the initiative developed during the COVID-19 pandemic by the Canadian Joint Operations Command, then headed up by Lieutenant General Mike Rouleau. But military commanders believed they didn't need to get approval from higher authorities to develop and proceed with the plan, retired Major General Daniel Gosselin, who was brought in to investigate the scheme, concluded in his report. The propaganda plan was developed and put in place in April 2020, even though the Canadian Forces had already acknowledged that, quote, information operations and targeting policies and doctrines are aimed at adversaries and have a limited application in a domestic concept, unquote. Oh, well, limited application. That's good to know. I mean, if Canada actually became, much more authoritarian state, totalitarian state, how different would it be from the way that it is now? As far as the media goes, it's the narrative. That's all that's allowed. That's all that is allowed. Apparently, Joe Biden muttered and stumbled today in his fake set. Keep your kids away from the unvaccinated. Social distancing on school buses. And then this is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Asked about his COVID testing shortage, Biden just stared blankly into the distance. And actually some signs of sanity from New York State. This is from Emma Colton at Fox News. New York makes major adjustment to COVID hospitalization reporting during Omicron surge. So we're looking at a critical moment, but we're going to start asking some questions. We talked about the hospitalizations. I've always wondered. We're looking at the hospitalizations of people testing positive in a hospital. Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul said Monday, is that person in the hospital because of COVID, or did they show up there and are routinely tested and showing positive, and they have been asymptomatic or even just had the sniffles? If she had said this a month ago, she would have been crucified. If any governor, maybe even DeSantis, had said this a month ago, would have been crucified. Now, the question they have to answer, and I don't know whether they'll be forced to answer this, why wasn't this done right from the very beginning? And let's see if there's anything new at Eugipius's Substack. He has a new piece called Errors Forced and Otherwise up. Complex human institutions which have eschewed a rigid hierarchy and command discipline for a looser consensus-based administration are characteristic of Western societies and their liberal democratic governments. Such institutions have a lot of idiosyncrasies, and among them is the inability to pursue any kind of complex strategy. Strategies are birthed in the minds of individuals or small groups. They require clear lines of command and a lot of people willing to follow orders unquestionably. Institutions that have succumbed to committee government have tendencies instead of strategies. Western corona policies reflect the diffuse, profoundly demobilized attitude of the institutions that sustain them. We might say that these are tendential rather than strategic regimes. Their policies are not machines carefully assembled to produce a desired outcome, but instead a random assemblage of everything that a few thousand different committees managed to dream up or copy from some other committees in other countries doing the same thing, all because they seem to serve the same basic end. Tendential policies will always be less than the sum of their parts. The aims of consensus-based administrative governments are not hidden. They cannot be, because the high degree of self-coordination these institutions demand. Thus, their aims are always both painfully overt and shamelessly simple to the point of seeming stupid. The aim of containment and mass vaccination policies quite clearly is the eradication of or the long-term suppression of SARS-CoV-2. This is not to say that every last person participating in this circus genuinely, sincerely, in their deepest self cares about whether SARS-2 goes away. It is only to say that no other purpose unites or explains the system as a whole. Cynical profiteers and grifters and opportunists all find themselves very much at home in Western institutions which do not plan or plot, but merely tend. Recognizing this is clarifying and important. Without an understanding of what it is our governments are trying to do, we will never be able to assess how they are progressing and, most importantly, the kinds of mistakes they make along the way. A lot of overtly conspiratorial analyses tend to reconstruct mistakes as, in fact, clever elements in highly complicated evil plots. This is demoralizing because it serves the myth of an omnipotent, omniscient adversary, but it's also confusing. The truth is that our adversaries make mistakes all the time, and many of these mistakes have typical characteristics from which we can learn. There is, for example, the mistake of over-vaccination. I know that a lot of you think the vaccines are themselves the goal, and for some of the grifters and opportunists in pharmaceutical land, that's surely the case. Nevertheless, imposing medications on people who don't need them is pointless. It cultivates unnecessary opposition, and is the sort of thing that, in the longer term, might even entail serious political and legal liability. Why can't you prove that you've recovered from corona with a positive antibody test and thereby achieve coveted recovered status? On May the 25th, 2021, some benighted intern at Germany's Federal Center for Health Education was compelled to explain this absurd but universally observed rule on the internet. It would be embarrassing to refute these inadequate, desperate paragraphs, and so I won't bother. This is what somebody who doesn't have an argument sounds like. In the view of the goals of corona containment, this is a clear, unforced error. Early in the vaccine campaign, when doses had to be rationed, it was obvious folly, even on the terms of the vaccinators, to jab the seropositive. Now that we know that the recovered enjoy vastly better immunity to SARS-2 than the vaccinated, it makes even less sense. Sure, the megaphone of the press can overcome mistakes like this and shut down the naysayers, but that's wasted energy they might have spent on some other project. Vaccinating the recovered is just a stupid thing to do. Another glaring, unforced error, writes Eugipius, is the failure to exploit seasonality, even at the level of cynical messaging. I've already discussed early efforts in this direction, but I did so behind the paywall. And he has some questions about what Germany is doing. It's not about corona anymore. As Bildt points out, the federal and state governments of Germany decided in a summit on November 18th that corona restrictions would be based no longer on infections, but on the hospitalization incidents. And they've just simply abandoned this in Germany. Let's go to Alex Berenson's Substack, and I'm going to be discussing his book Pandemia on the book club on Friday. Old man shouts at cloud. For sale, one president slightly used lies on command. Biden says this continues to be a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Oh, he said that today. And we have a graph from Alex Berenson. Meanwhile, back in reality, here are the latest figures from Ontario. I'd give you the US numbers, but oopsie, our government doesn't provide them. More than 70% of people in the hospital with COVID are vaccinated. And we know, because I was just talking about it a few minutes ago, that overwhelmingly the new cases are people who are double or triple vaccinated. Let's go to William Briggs, statistician, to the stars. Well, what more can we say that we haven't done dozens of times? Although there is here and there some hope that panic is waning, female safety firsters, effeminates, and soy jacks still desire the panic to continue. as do any whose jobs can be done, a loose word, by Zoom. Who wants to start commuting back to an office now after they've seen the paradise of the couch? Imagine having to drag your keister in front of a group of bored proto-adults whose masks might even slip, frightening you almost beyond your ability to function, and to lecture these kiddies on some subject you no longer love, just so the kiddies can get a degree. Isn't it better to forbid the students to gather so you can sit at home and push a few buttons instead? Much easier than putting your mind at work at questioning the official narrative. I focus on brain sink institutions because I have received reports from several sources saying the very few remaining employees of universities are required to test for corona doom weekly. This is what our most intelligent people have derived as a solution. Truly, we live in a time of great stupidity. This is from Ewan Lacour. The Australian government officially acknowledges the reality of severe adverse effects, and dozens of thousands, underreported anyway, of people will now offer financial compensation. It only just begun. And Briggs comments, "Hey gang, it's looking like it's time for yet another conspiracy theory to get its wings." But Stephen Marr assured us that this never, almost never happens. What is this? Dozens of thousands of people. That doesn't seem tremendously rare to me, although my definition of rarity might be different than others. Oh, and modelers. Let's hear from the modelers. This is Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Sage government advisors say that there'd be 3,000 to 5,000 daily Omicron deaths in January. That would be in England without further lockdown restrictions. Today, the official number of COVID-19 deaths was 48. I guess, if you keep getting things wrong, not just wrong, but disastrously wrong, and you don't get punished, there's not much of an incentive to change one's praxis, is there? And let's take a look at thedailyskeptic.org. Pupils vilified if they don't take COVID tests or wear masks in class, according to the Telegraph. London's COVID cases and admissions peak without overwhelming NHS, figures suggest. That's again in the Telegraph. Heads warn of weeks of Omicron disruption in English schools. Chinese-style mass testing must end if we're ever to learn to live with COVID. Modelers are heading for a showdown. Is this the most bizarre anti-vaccine conspiracy yet? The Telegraph's Michael Deacon on the tiny flaw in the supposed plan to okay, I'm not going to repeat that. And why Mill's harm principle is useless against mandatory vaccination. Boris says we can ride out this Omicron wave. Djokovic granted permission to compete in Australian Open despite being unvaccinated. Could this have something to do with money? Here comes the French variant. And I'm looking at a bunch of people right near the Eiffel Tower in Paris, outside with masks on. Scientists at the IHU Mediterranean Infection in Marseille, France, have announced the discovery of a new variant of SARS-CoV-2, which they say has more mutations than Omicron and may be more resistant to vaccines. Oh, dear. Hospital admissions of children with eating disorders surge 70% since pandemic. Even Professor Lockdown, or Pants Down, as he is also known, admits Omicron plateauing. That would be the disastrous for decades Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London. Wearing face masks in school classrooms is not a requirement, government guidance shows. And just one more thing on this. Yes, in the Return to Sanity file, CNN tweeted yesterday, people who are overweight or obese are at a much higher risk of much more severe disease and even death from COVID-19. And one new study suggests that losing weight can reduce that risk. Who would have guessed? Except we've known this from the very beginning. It's the same thing. Again, the parallels with AIDS. They just keep happening. Who's getting AIDS? Oh, everyone is at risk of AIDS. No. And we have known that since the very beginning. But we just, decided to pretend otherwise. Let's take a look at the chat. Whoa. Yeah, here's a chat comment without context. Anne Run says, I think 37 millimeter is the smallest I have in my small collection. Choken 666 responds, again, without any context, I can't really be comfortable with anything over 40 millimeters now. True Greenberg asks, anyone remember swatches? I associate them with that great movie Heathers. Metal Mike says, Djokovic had COVID in 2020. I'm sure he has natural immunity. Oh, we're talking about watches here, are we? Enra says, I prefer 40 or smaller, but we'll go up to 42, perhaps a little higher for a chronograph. I missed it. What did Sam Hyde says St. Martin 17773. Well, let's go back. Let's go back to what Sam Hyde said. Bring it up again. He said, when we win, do not forget that these people want you broke, dead, your kids raped and brainwashed, and they think it's funny. That's what Sam Hyde said. He also said some things about what journalists that I'm not going to repeat. Wow. As that fellow at pitch meetings says, Ryan George. Wow. My country has lost its mind. My country has absolutely lost its mind. Okay? Because, bad things happening in America, maybe civil war, at least, great civic unrest. And so the first question that anyone would ask was, what's Canada going to do about that? There's a long blurt in the Globe and Mail by Thomas Homer Dixon that appeared on December the 31st. And who is this fellow when he's at home? Is he identified? I don't know that he's identified. The American polity is cracked and might collapse. Canada must prepare. The U.S. is becoming increasingly ungovernable, and some experts believe it could descend into civil war. What should Canada do then? Oh, Thomas Homer Dixon is executive director of the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. His latest book is Commanding Hope, the Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. By 2025, American democracy could collapse, causing extreme domestic political instability, including widespread civil violence. By 2030, if not sooner, this country could be governed by a right-wing dictatorship. I'm tempted to say, from your lips to God's ear. Ooh, as early as that. We mustn't dismiss these possibilities just because they seem ludicrous or too horrible to imagine. In 2014, the suggestion that Donald Trump would become president would also have struck nearly everyone as absurd. But today we live in a world where the absurd regularly becomes real and the horrible commonplace. Leading U.S. academics are now actively addressing the prospect of a fatal weakening of U.S. democracy. This past November, more than 150 professors of politics, government, political economy, and international relations appealed to Congress to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, which would protect the integrity of U.S. elections, but is now stalled in the Senate. This is a moment of great peril and risk, they wrote. Time is ticking away, and midnight is approaching. I'm a scholar of violent conflict. For more than 40 years, I've studied and published on the causes of war, social breakdown, revolution, ethnic violence, and genocide. And for nearly 2 decades, I led a center on peace and conflict studies at the University of Toronto. Yeah, you notice this word democracy? Going back to what Michael Anton was saying, that to people like this fellow, who is clearly a member of, the laptop class, democracy means we win. It means we win forever. And if the other guys win, it's not legitimate. Now, as we're told, elections cannot be faked in the United States. where Democrats claim that the Republicans stole the 2000 election, the 2004 election, the 2016 election. And of course, there's Stacey Abrams, who never conceded when she lost her race for governor. The word democracy appears 17 times in this story. Oh, Rush Limbaugh gets kicked around. And Rush Limbaugh had no political force at all. Rush Limbaugh was the old politics where, let's bitch about, say megadittos. And those clowns in Congress have done it again. No, there was no political organizing going there. Of course, Rush Limbaugh campaigned for W. But no, democracy. Oh, let's see. Two other material factors are key. The first is demographic. As immigration, aging, intermarriage, and the decline in church-going have reduced the percentage of non-Hispanic white Christians in America, right-wing ideologues have inflamed fears that traditional U.S. culture is being erased and whites are being replaced. Again, this is an example of what Anton talked about, that it's good that thing that isn't happening is happening. Oh, fears that the traditional U.S. culture is being erased and whites are being replaced. And why would they think that? Because as immigration, aging, intermarriage, and decline in church-going have reduced the percentage of non-Hispanic white Christians in America. Democracy, attacking U.S. democracy. Democracy is an institution, but underpinning that institution is a vital set of beliefs and values. Not really, actually. Democracy at its base means, demos plus kratos. Kratos being rather a brutal, sense of power of the people. And this is just interminable. The experts I consulted described a range of possible outcomes if Trump returns to power, none benign. They cited particular countries and political regimes to illustrate where he might take the U.S. Viktor Orban's Hungary, with its coercive legal apparatus of illiberal democracy. Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil, with its chronic social distemper and administrative dysfunction. Or Vladimir Putin's Russia, with its harsh one-man hyper-nationalist autocracy. In a way, things must be going pretty well. If just some clown, some waster like Thomas Homer Dixon is so upset. But wait, people, it gets better. It gets much, much better. Because John Ibbitson, who is considered to be, one of the great political experts in Canada, a longtime expert at the Globe and Mail, writes, if the next presidential election shows that the United States is headed for political instability and even violence, what can Canada do? And then he mentions the Thomas Homer Dixon piece. I don't believe the future is so dire. The culture and economy of the United States remain strong and resilient, able to withstand high levels of political dysfunction, but it appears that a large majority of American voters have lost faith in their political system, fueled by media organizations such as Fox News, who try and benefit from that segregation. Supporters of former President Donald Trump prevail within the Republican Party and are determined to win the next election by hook or by crook. American politics is broken and may collapse. Canada should prepare. Typically, when asked about U.S. presidential elections, Canadian prime ministers say they look forward to working with whoever wins. But this time, it might not cut it. The U.S. presidential election of 2024 can greatly affect the future of this country. Do we just stand and watch? Stephanie Carwin researches security issues at Cartoon University. It's actually called Carleton, but most people call it Cartoon University. He believes Canada acting on its own will have little effect on the U.S. election. File it under the DOI. Our voices don't sound loud in the conversation that is happening in the United States, he said in an interview. It may be possible for Canada to join with other NATO members, the European Union, the G7, or any other assembly of affiliated states to express concern for and support American democracy, but allied leaders have to tread carefully. It's a risk-reward thing, Professor Carbon explained. Trump hates the EU and he hates NATO. If he or any other U.S. ally was seen trying to influence the outcome of an election won by Trump, he believes this could lead to further action against the coalition. Peter Lowen, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, believes Canada should remain on edge, no matter what. I'm hesitant to say that we should get involved, he told me. But he believes that Canada's economic and political leadership should prepare now for the prospect of a post-democratic America. We have to think of the unimaginable, and that we're not really close to them in the future, and a lack of policy imagination has kept us from really thinking deeply about it. What would NORAD or NATO look like in a world in which the United States is internally divided to the point of instability? To what extent can multilateral organizations such as the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization function without U.S. involvement? These questions are stomach-churning, but it is better to face them than to watch passively. We need to strengthen our army. What army? And defend our borders, especially in the north. From whom? Does Russia lack a sufficient amount of frozen wasteland? We need to strengthen our ties with other democracies and promote democracy through trade and cultural ties. And we need to engage with the United States, however it evolves, as a great power we live together and should get along with. A future in which the United States is no longer a stable democracy is not a future any of us want to face, but we may have little choice. And Twitchy, notice this. And Sam J comments, oh my God, themselves. And if you want to go to Detroit, nobody's stopping you, according to Amish Dude. LOL, Canada has never intervened anywhere. They're going to take on America. Oh, my sides. MB Campbell says embargo on maple syrup, broadcasting previously unreleased Bryan Adams songs across the border, screen off the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. I mean, what other options do they have? Alan Bayer comments, sure, do it. We'll just use your intervention as an excuse to annex parts of Canada. Hopefully Denmark will also try to intervene. The world needs more Canada. People used to say this. I never knew what it meant. No, there's nothing that, we could do. Nothing at all that we could do. Hey, do you know that they're burning books in Canada? I just found out about this yesterday. More than 4,700 books were removed from library shelves at 30 schools in Ontario Francophone schools and have been burned or in the process of being recycled. And why? Because it's a flame purification ceremony. We bury the ashes of racism, discrimination, and stereotypes in the hope that we will grow up in an inclusive country where we can all live in prosperity and security. Yes, apparently these books were old, asterisks and stuff like that. So they have to be removed because they're not sufficiently indigenized. So they actually had a book burning ceremony in Catholic schools in Ontario. And no, I saw that Ibsen piece, and I saw that Ibsen piece, and I thought, is this what COVID does to people? Is that what it does to people? It drives them mad. A journalist called Tara Henley caused something of a stir in my country by releasing a piece on Substack called Speaking Freely, Why I Resigned from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I must confess, I look for news stories. The CBC has a pretty good website in terms of, what you can find on it. Several websites. They have regional ones as well. I don't watch the CBC ever for nothing. And I haven't for decades. It's worthless. I've noticed the CBC stories. There's no pretense of a balancing of opinion or of interests. No, some horrible thing is happening here, and here's a bunch of people saying that it's a horrible thing, or some crisis must be met with further suppression of freedom of speech. Or, as Tara Henley writes, people want to know why, for example, non-binary Filipinos concerned about a lack of alphabet people terms in Tagalog is an editorial priority for the CBC. Years ago, when I was cataloging at the University of British Columbia, cataloging books, we were allowed for a period, I don't know, 6-9 months or something like that, to listen to music on headphones. So I used to listen to CBC FM, or I don't know what they call it now, CBC2, something like that, which was their classical music station. And but they would have these art reports, and I noticed that there were things that they were looking for. That there were things, any excuse to do an art report on anything to do with Native Indians, 1, homosexuality, 2, or 3, ballet. And one day they hit the trifecta. A homosexual Native Indian had written a ballet called Something Silly. And that was how long ago? That was something like 40 years ago. But no, there's no, it's just $1.2 billion they're given by the government. Michael Tracy noted this on Twitter a couple of days ago, that he said he finds that the CBC completely unlistenable, unwatchable now, and how it had gone the way of NPR. Anran says, I'm told there is a very good and depressing, I'm not supposed to mention this site, thread on how bad libraries have become with getting rid of older and classic books. Yes, I have seen that. I told KMG about the book burning over a month ago, says Popcasso 88. I'm sorry, I missed that. Respectable commenting name says Vermont syrup is better than Canadian syrup, even if they hadn't already bled the national stockpile of it ready. I'm told that most American maple syrup in the United States, sold in the United States, comes from the state of New York. Hello to Che Blutarski. The Canadian government has apologized for Bryan Adams many times. I don't really have anything against Bryan Adams. It's not my kind of thing, but he's very good at it. No Sleep says if a Republican somehow wins the office in 24, Canada will continue to cower and do nothing. I don't know. The United States or Canada would have reason to be pleased, at least one reason to be pleased, because I think that if Trump is reelected, the pipeline is going to go ahead. The stymied pipeline, it is going to go ahead one way or the other. We won't necessarily be able to punish those at the top of the pyramid, but there are a multitude of little Faucis down the line, says True Greenbird. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to what Music Monday. I wasn't on the air yesterday, but you know that already. And I'm going to talk about a remarkable woman who styled herself Nico. And she was born in 1938 and she died in 1988 at the age of 49. Her bicycle got hit. She fell off it, smacked her head. There's a lot of mystery about this woman who was a singer, a songwriter, a musician, an actress, and a model. And she appears in La Dolce Vita, as well as Andy Warhol film. It would appear there were a lot of, I would say, rumors put out about her back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, that she was actually Russian, or she was the result of, I don't know, something that happened in World War II. But it would appear that her actual name was Christa Pefkin, and that she was a German from Köln, and that she came from a pretty solid upper-class background. There is a book by Richard Witz, came out in 1995, called Nico, The Life and Lies of an Icon. It's quite good, and I highly recommend it. So Nico began working as a model as a teenager, first in Berlin, and then moved to Paris. And her most iconic look, I suppose, is the one that you would find on the first Velvet Underground album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, or on her album A Chelsea Girl, where she has a dyed blonde hair. Nico is famous for all sorts of things. I suppose I don't want to make too much of this. She's famous for famous men that she had affairs with. And these included Jim Morrison and Bob Dylan and Iggy Pop and Jackson Browne when he was 16 years old, and Lou Reed and others. She appeared on the cover of several jazz albums and other albums. And her first single, she was signed to Andrew Lowe Goldman's Immediate label, which was the hippest label in Britain at the time. And rather incredibly, her first single was a cover of a song by, yes, Canadian Gordon Lightfoot. And it was produced by no less than Jimmy Page. How about that? It was not a success. Andy Warhol or Paul Morrissey, much of that, which is particularly with regard to the Velvet Underground, well, and Warhol's later films, which are attributed to Andy Warhol, this was Paul Morrissey, actually. Paul Morrissey gets nowhere near the credit that he deserves. And I suppose I've read interviews with Morrissey, and I know that he's somewhat irritated about this. But Andy Warhol was such a name in the mid-'60s in the United States and the world that I don't know whether the Velvet Underground would have ever been signed if it not for Andy Warhol fronting them and pretending to produce them. So Andy Warhol thought, or Paul Morrissey thought, that it would be a good thing for this new band that he was fronting and producing, but not really, to have a woman in it. Well, they already had a woman. They had Maureen Tucker, the drummer, but to have a gorgeous blonde model sing with them. And so she did on the record, The Velvet Underground and Nico, the one with the famous peelable banana cover by Andy Warhol. Nico, she harkens back to, I suppose, a European tradition that was largely extinct by that time. The doleful chanteuse, and she does very well on the first Velvet Underground record. She sings a couple of songs, and I'm sure a lot of people were tempted to buy the record simply because of her picture on it. It's a shame about the first Velvet Underground record that one of the persons that was involved in the Exploding Plastic Inevitable as a dancer, he made a fuss about payment for the use of his photograph on the album, and as a result, it was delayed about 6 months, and which is a shame because it would have had a lot more impact if it had come out earlier. The band, they were always of two minds. Nico appearing with them. That you have a singer who is not going to be singing every song. What's the person going to do? That's always a problem, right? I suppose she could just stand on the stage and look pretty or pretend to dance or something. Not that Nico ever did that. But anyway, it was decided that they were going to go separate ways. And Nico was given a recording contract with the same label that the Velvets were on, which was MGM. And her first record was released, because of the delay, uh, in 1967, and it was called Chelsea Girl, which of course is the name of a notorious film by Andy Warhol that she appeared in. It's produced by Tom Wilson, who was also the producer of the first Velvet Underground album. Well, the first two. Tom Wilson wasn't really much of a producer. By all accounts, Tom Wilson spent most of his time when he was supposedly producing records talking to women on the phone. Tom Wilson was quite fond of women, and they were quite fond of him in turn. It's a strange record. I mean, I suppose Nico decided that she was going to call in some favors, and you've got a lot of talent, songwriting talent on this record. You have Jackson Browne, one of his great songs these days. I can't say that I liked Jackson Browne's 70s California recordings. They just strike me as being both smug and strident. But his songs, The Fairest and the Seasons, and particularly These Days, are beautiful songs. We have Tim Hardin with his eulogy to Lenny Bruce. Tim Hardin, like Nico, was a junkie, and he pissed away his talent. He had Reason to Believe. He wrote that song, which was a huge hit for Rod Stewart. If I Were a Carpenter was a huge hit for many people, but again, he was a junkie and couldn't keep it together. There are songs on this record by Lou Reed and John Cale and Sterling Morrison. Bob Dylan contributed his song "I'll Keep It With Mine." You could say that about half the record is chamber pop, and the arrangements were by a man called Larry Fallon. And Nico said that she cried when she heard them, not because she was so delighted, because she thought they were hideous, kitsch. And I like the strings, do not like the flutes. But then everyone says that, so I'm going to agree with everyone. But half the record, I suppose, is what you could call noise rock. Songs like Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams, and It Was a Pleasure Then, the sort of thing that one would expect to hear on a Velvet Underground record. Nico was an extraordinarily difficult person to get along with. And record companies would sign her and then decide that this is a nightmare and she doesn't sell any records, so we're moving on. Or she would decide that I don't like what they did and move on. But the second Nico solo record came out in November 1968, and it is called The Marble Index. And it's just a cover photograph by a Guy Webster is just, it's iconic. It is supposedly produced by a man called Fraser Mohawk. He was born Barry Friedman, but he decided that Fraser Mohawk sounded more, 1968 or whatever. And he was married to a woman, a pretty hippie chick, who was named Sandra Hurwitz, but became Esra Mohawk, who made some interesting records. This is a John Cale record, no question about it. It is one of the strangest records ever made. It's pop music. It's more like modern classical music, actually. And Nico sang. She also played the harmonium, which is a pump organ, the Indian design. It's a sort of thing that you would find in, I don't know, small churches that couldn't afford a proper organ, but that was her instrument. And this is a record that is practically all the instruments except for the harmonium are played by John Cale, and he's dragged an orchestra in there. And there's a Frozen Warnings, Evening of Light, that the last song on the original 8-track. It sounds like a symphony orchestra being strangled with piano wire. And this was Nico the original goth? I think you'd have to say that she was, certainly in terms of music. That her hair was originally brunette. She dyed it blonde, and by this time, in order to go full goth, she decided she handed her hair so that it was quite very dark brown. It looked pretty much close to black, although her hair appears to be black on this cover. This is one of those records that I suppose you could say not everyone, not like the Velvet Underground record that that anyone who bought a copy formed their own band, because how are you going to form a Nico band? It's on Elektra Records at that time, which was very avant-garde, and it's quite a remarkable thing. Okay, you're supposed to be some genius, and your first record, you didn't really get to do what you wanted to do, so we're going to let you do, or whatever John Cale wants to do, and it's going to cost a fair amount of money, and it's not going to sell anything, and then years later, people are going to say, oh, this so very influential, in a way, in a particular sub-genre of doom pop. It has been influential. There is a song on it called Ari's Song. It would seem that Nico had an affair with the great French actor Alain Delon, and a son resulted, and Delon denied it for years and years and years. And I believe they were court proceedings. But this is crazy and medieval and just absolutely shocking. Now, let's see. Her next album, and I'm going to talk about the two of them together. The next album appeared 2 years later, and of course, it wasn't on Elektra, because I mentioned before, she didn't stick around with record companies. It's called Desert Shore. And it was produced by John Cale and co-produced by Joe Boyd, who of course was Nick Drake's manager, and many others. And it has her son, Ari. Well, there's a song. She's written a song about him called My Only Child. And then this is very strange. The next song is called Le Petit Chevalier, where we have this little boy singing an old French nursery rhyme. And then you flip the record over, as you used to in those days. And the next song is John Cale on the viola. And he's Nico singing a song called Abschied, which is in German and is about her mother's funeral. There's another German song, Mütterlein, on it as well. It is less stark, harsh than the Marble Index, and it's a beautiful record as well. And oh yes, there's stills from the record. Nico appeared in several films by the avant-garde filmmaker Philippe Garrel, and the stills from this one, from this movie, Les Cicatrices Intérieures, the interior scar, and it's all very mysterious. We see Nico on a horse, which is being led by a boy, which is her son, in the desert. And okay, the record's called Desert Shore, not that there's much about the desert in it. But who else but Nico could write a song called A Janitor of Lunacy? Stark. John Cale is using a much reduced palette on this record. Now, I should say that a few years ago, there was a compilation in 2007. Rhino put out a compilation called The Frozen Borderline 1968 to 1970. And this is the Marble Index and Desert Shore, plus a whole host of outtakes and alternative versions. And this is one of the great packages that I've ever seen. You have the album remixed, and we get surprises like Nibelungen from the Marble Index, and different versions, some of which could be considered to be better. They're certainly fascinating, no question about it. This is like the greatest cornucopia of avant pop weirdness that you're ever going to come across. Nico then moved on to Island Records, where there was an attempt, to make her a star, actually to make a bunch of people stars at the same time. So the record, The End, came out in November 1974, and it has another still from a Philippe Garrel film. Oh, it's got Brian Eno on it, too, to make it even more exotic. There was a concert at the Rainbow Theatre on June the 1st, 1974, which featured Kevin Ayers, John Cale, Brian Eno, and Nico. And there's a bunch of other famous people there as well, including Mike Oldfield and Robert Wyatt. And it was released on a record by Island, which was imaginatively called June the 1st, 1974. But since it's Ayers, Cale, Nico, and Eno, people called it the Acne concert, or the Acne record. And it's got some good things on it. John Cale's version of Heartbreak Hotel is quite good. And a really driving version of The Doors' The End, which, of course, she attempts on the record The End. And I don't know whether it's being deliberately controversial or not. She sings what became the national anthem of Germany and Austria. Haydn's tune is a Kaiser. It's Kaiser song, only with the original words, which became so controversial. Das Lied der Deutschen by Hoffmann von Fallersleben. And it's got some great stuff on it. It's got some really great stuff. It's got Phil Manzanera playing electric guitar, and Eno's synthesizers are wintry, I think you could say. Typically, John Cale plays everything else. And the record was not a success, not the way that Island Records expected it to be. And Island had, I gathered, spent a fair amount of money poaching Kevin Ayers from Harvest Records, and it didn't work for them. And he made a whole bunch more records and disappeared, and made a comeback shortly before his death. So Nico started to tour an awful lot. She played with French musicians. She played with English musicians. And there's a whole bunch of Nico records out there. You have this situation where, we have the same record come out twice, only different. And I don't think that these later records can be considered as good as the first three. John Cale returned for the record Camera Obscura, which was recorded with an English group called The Faction. And James Young wrote extensively about Nico. I don't know, it's pretty good, but you think of the record came out at 1985. John Cale was not in a good place in those days. John Cale was kind of a coked out monster for many years. You know, he was brought in to add, you know, the sort of avant-garde classical class, you know. Supposedly produced Patti Smith's first record, Horses, but then it turns out that, you know, I mean, how much producing was he doing? But everything by Nico is interesting. And seeing her, you know, try out classics like My Funny Valentine. Later, she made it. She essayed Bowie's Heroes, and there's also just a whole bunch of Nico live records, including one that existed as a bootleg for many, many years, and it was brought out officially. And it's sort of a reunion, a kind of reunion of the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, John Cale, and Nico at the Bataclan Club in Paris in 1972, which is certainly worth hearing as well. But I have to say, you know, if you're interested in things that are strange or visionary in music, that the second and third Nico records, The Marble Index and Desert Shore, you know, you won't be disappointed. So those are my thoughts about the singular Nico. Hello to Professor Paul. Kakwa Pajravaitia. Alper says, the Velvet's got a lot less interesting without John Cale. No, I'm a big, big fan of Doug Yule, an enormous fan of Doug Yule, who I believe got completely shafted. He wasn't invited, you know, in the reunion. Let's see. Doug Yule plays a bass. He plays guitar. It's most of his lead work on Loaded. He plays a piano and organ and drums, and he can sing. He can sing a hell of a lot better than Lou Reed. So why wouldn't you want that fellow in your reunion band? Jeffrey Pye says, I've long enjoyed Cale's Paris 1919 and Fear. Yes, Paris 1919 is an outstanding record. It's got an outstanding cover, too. Chris Thomas produced it. And the Fear record, which is the first of his Island records. No, that's really good as well. Visionary Companion says, Dr. My Eyes was a fluke. I don't like Jackson Browne either, with the exception of that song. Quachalango says, check out Rotterdam band Lewisburg if you want to hear some very derivative but very good Velvet type groups. Hat tip to Dennis Dale. Denny McDougall says that another good use of a woman front singer who doesn't always sing is to have her sit blindfolded and knitting a la Yoko Ono on the track Instant Karma. Jesse Ed Davis. Wow, that's he was a Native American Indian studio cat. When he played with Taj Mahal, very highly regarded, but then he fell in John Lennon's crowd, and just such depravity. Such depravity. Courtney L has no talent. Nico had talent, says Visionary Companion. John Cale's cover of Frozen Borderlines is beautiful in spite of the video with the Cy Twombly painting in the background. Oh, why can't I mention that site now? I can mention it. It's a private site, though. You know, people who know of it, they know of it, you know. None of this is possible without a good producer, says Don Willis. Just saying. Well, I'm going to wrap it up now. What do we have coming up here? I'm going to be talking about, on Theater Thursday, a musical film called The Sparks Brothers. It's a documentary by Edgar Wright, and it is absolutely delightful. And on the book club, I'm going to be talking about Alex Berenson's Pandemia and Music Monday. Next week, I'm going to be talking about Donald Fagen, one of my favorites. That's it for today. Thank you all for tuning in. Much appreciated. I'll be back on the air at 4 p.m. Pacific. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. Thanks to all those who have donated. So very greatly appreciated by me. As always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.